I'm Janie Lantz.
And I'm Sue Hausmann. And we've talked about a lot of different techniques on these little videos in the Learning Center. We hope that you're watching them. They've used different battings, and we've been talking about threads, and I'd like to really elaborate on that because in the last little batting video, we talked about using different fillers, like fleece, for example, as your batting, quote unquote, or wadding, or maybe a thinner batting that you might use. And this would all have to do with your embroidery designs, and we talked a little bit about that. For thicker designs, you'd use longer stitches. Well, we want to talk about the fact that that's important when you're using different threads as well. And I think it's neat to see some of the different effects you can get with different threads. We're so fortunate today that there are a multitude of threads designed for quilters, specifically for quilters.
Yes.
And for quilting your machine, whether it be a solid color or an invisible color, we have lots of options. And Janie, when we use a thicker thread, we want to have our stitches further apart, so that there's room for the thread to lay. Otherwise, we may get bubbling or kind of a squished up effect. So you're going to talk a little about that, aren't you?
Actually, in our 5D QuiltDesign Creator software, we have that wizard that lets us create blocks or create a work area or start an element. And if we're creating a new quilt block, if you guys are going to create a quilt block, you would want to pick your shape, of course, and we're going to actually leave a space in the center free so that we can put some cool stuff into it. So we have those 50 elegant, wonderful shapes that we can pick from. And we thought maybe this time a star. Would you like a star?
That's a fun one. I like stars.
I love stars too. So we can take this star. Now remember, around the outside it's going to make our stipple stitches, or in the next one we can see that we could do channel or parallel quilting. But we haven't played with the motif stitches very much, and I love these different motifs that are available to us. And we even have options in our motifs. And this is where you would start looking at how dense your stitching is, right?
Yes, right. Yes. Because if it's too dense, you're going to have difficulty stitching it out with the heavier threads, the 30 weights, and even some people go to a 12 weight, but I generally stick with a 30.
Right. Especially on an embroidery machine where the stitches are preset for us. So we have a lot of different groups, categories of stitches. And I love in the geometrics, we have all these wonderful different shapes.
Can you pull that down one more time? Because the E stitches I see would be for your embroidery machine folks. And the Q stitches would be for people with long arm quilters working with the quilting robot. Because the Q stitches are much larger and more open. Okay, for the more appropriate for the big area.
So we're going to choose from the E stitches because we're making an embroidery quilting design this time. And we're going to use this star. And you can see our little stars here, and they're pretty close together, aren't they?
Yeah, bring it in and let us see it. We can come back, right?
We can.
I think if we brought this up and saw it, we would see, wow, that is really clustery stars. And for my heavier threads, I want them to be more distinguished and further apart.
Right.
More space to lay the thread.
So if we go back into the options, we can actually change the size of the stars and make each motif much, much larger. So we can make it 1 inch or 1.5 inches per star. And then, of course, we can change the star patterns as well, so we can offset the rows of stars.
Okay, cool.
Now we're getting a more open texture and a little bit of a different look. So now you can see those stars in the background, and at this point all we have to do is select Finish. But one more thing you'd want to do before you actually exported this as a quilting design, you would want to make sure that you go into Preferences. And because would we want a triple stitch in a very heavy thread?
No.
No.
We'd want to use a running stitch for sure.
Yes. And we can even adjust the stitch length. Here you can see I've got it set at almost a 3mm stitch.
Where we might want a triple stitch was if we used a very fine thread and we wanted it to be more defined, the design.
Right.
But in a heavier thread, definitely the running stitch would be very visible.
Yes, indeed.
The design itself. Well, we do have a lot of different threads. You would simply now go, write that to your USB stick, put it in your embroidery machine, or of course those that have created for the frame would do that. And these threads are beautiful on the frame as well. Most of you know that I don't have a frame yet, although they're talking me into one here, but and I think I need one. But basically, when we use a lot of different threads, we would use a spool pin that actually works as a vertical spool pin so that we come up and into it, because they may not reel off as well or fit onto some of our thread delivery systems on different embroidery machines. There's all different kinds of spools. And we want to choose, of course, always quality thread. One of the things I do like is that they're telling you today on many of them what size needle to use for the quilting thread. In other words, it will say this is 30 weight, and for it use a 90-100 top stitch needle.
That's interesting.
Extra long eye with a top stitch needle and a deeper groove in the front. That's where the thread lays as it goes in and out, in and out, in and out. And of course, two things. If the hole that was poked is not large enough, then as it goes in and out, it's going to shred, fray back your thread. Have you ever had that happening? Jump up a needle size, okay? Go up a needle size. The other thing, if the thread isn't laying into the groove, if it's not deep enough, it's not protected as the thread goes in and out, because the piece of thread being sewn into the stitch right now has already been in and out many times.
Yes.
Yeah. One way, a little tip from Nancy Goldsworthy, is to actually thread the thread you're planning to use on the needle you're planning to use, and go like this. Swing it up and down on the needle and see if it moves freely. If it moves freely, you've got a large enough eye there. If it doesn't, you need to go up to a bigger size.
And it's also important to change that needle pretty often, isn't it?
It is. And whether you're long arming or whether you are quilting with embroidery, and I learned that as I was making my samples for these videos. I had a little glitch and I stopped, changed the needle, and it solved everything. The other thing I wanted to be sure to talk about is bobbins and the foot you're using. Obviously, we know the needle is important, and we want to use a quilting 80 or 90 needle depending on the size of our thread, or, as I said with a lot of these, a top stitch needle because of that longer eye. But I've seen a lot of people trying to do embroidery quilting with their hoop with a floating foot, and that rests over the top of what they're quilting. And what that means is that as the needle comes out of the fabric, it can lift the fabric off the throat plate, off the stitch plate. And so we want to use one of the, what are called spring action feet, or some people call them hopper feet, or jumper feet. But it is your embroidery foot. And remember, I'm talking now about the embroidery machine, because you do have a foot like this on your long arm, for sure, for your quilting. As it goes up and down, it holds the fabric to the plate as the stitch is being formed. Super important. You know, you mentioned the heavy buildup of thread, and that's why I have these 3 stippling samples, which are very, very tightly, they call it mini stippling or micro stippling, and they're done with a 60 weight thread, which most of you know is a fine weight thread. This one is polyester, designed for quilters to look like silk and stitch out and look and feel like silk, but it actually is poly, and it's a lot less expensive and stronger than silk.
And you matched your bobbin, I noticed.
Oh, virtually always I would match my bobbin on quilting, because we want the backside of our quilt to look beautiful too. And this is a relatively strong thread. We want to keep in mind that we don't want to use too light a bobbin thread. Some people will use regular bobbin thread for embroidery, but that can be a very lightweight thread and break too easily when you're using it in a quilting situation where the quilt will be used. But normally, if you were to do this in a heavier thread, it would build up way too thick. This is where you need to have the lighter weight threads. I have quite a few examples here of the same design with some different threads and some different lofts. I just thought it might be valuable to show the fact that this beautiful design with the feathers and lots of very little micro stippling is beautiful done in that 60 weight over 2 plies. You know, threads are either 2 ply or 3 ply usually, except for monofilament, which is a single filament. But here you see our 2 ply 60 weight. Now, I wanted to be sure to say that here's rayon thread, and a lot of people love to embroider with rayon thread, the 40 weight rayon, and it does a beautiful job as well. But here again, I would recommend matching that bobbin thread, and you have to look really hard at this quilting created in the beautiful 5D Quilt Design Creator to see which is the underside. It does such a beautiful job stitching. And then here are invisible thread. Now people always laugh when they say invisible, but it's the monofilament, and I recommend the polyester because you can iron over it, you can wash it, you can go in the dryer, but it's also easier to work with. When you wind your bobbins with all of these specialty threads, wind them at a slower speed. Set down the speed of the bobbin winder, and for invisibles, I suggest all the way down. Polyester invisible comes in the smoke color too for your darker color fabrics, but here you virtually don't see the thread. You see the actual loft and the quilting design. This is a low loft cotton. Now here we see extra loft puffy with that 60 weight poly. So we get a lot more loft from these little feather trapuntos. Just different looks with different threads. This one, the 40 weight rayon, again, color with the low loft, and the different colors of thread will make a very big difference in the end result. You may want to sew out a sample block and just see what it's going to look like. How about the metallic threads? Now you can use those top and bobbin on most machines, but if you have an issue, then go ahead and wind your sewing thread in the bobbin and just have the top of the quilt be the shiny metallic. And then finally we have some examples of some of those threads that change color as you go, here on your low loft and here on your high loft. So you see the difference of the loft in those feathers, and that's what some people are looking for.
I
Again,
have a question for you, Sue.
uh-oh, what is it?
You created that block yourself, didn't you?
I did.
And how did you learn how to make that block?
Well, the first thing I did when I received my 5D QuiltDesign Creator software system was to open my user's guide. And this user's guide, created by Helen Kamer of the software team, is actually fabulous to learn your software. And you can work your way through the exercises in the user's guide, and you'll know everything you can do virtually.
Or you can go to the 5D Learning Center, and that is recorded as a learning tutorial as well,
Okay.
with voiced over instructions. So do be sure to visit 5D Learning Center and watch those videos there too.
Great.